Hello and welcome, everyone. I hope you're all enjoying the conference so far. My name's Terry and I work at Kale, and I'm glad that you've all joined us today for this session. It's Complex, meeting the diverse needs of online higher education students. Before we get started, I'd like to share a couple of quick housekeeping tips. If you have not already done so, if you would like, you can introduce yourself and meet fellow attendees in the chat box. All attendees are muted. So if you have any questions for our speaker, we ask that you put those in the chat and then they will be addressed as we go along with the presentation. Also, the session is being recorded and it can be accessed for the next 90 days after the conference. And then lastly, please remember to fill out our evaluation at the end of the session. Your feedback is greatly appreciated. With that, I'd like to introduce and welcome our speaker. Julie Benish is the department chair for the online business psychology programs at the Chicago School. So I'll now hand this presentation over to her. Thanks.
Thank you, Terry, and welcome everyone. I'm super excited to be talking about this. I've done a lot of similar things. I love to think about this. I think about it all the time. Been working with adult online students in higher ed for over a decade. And I want to start with this quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes. You might have heard it. For the simplicity, he says, on this side of complexity, I wouldn't give you a fig. For the simplicity on the other side of complexity, for that, I would give you anything I have. And I really love that because on the one hand, we don't want to oversimplify what is complex to the point where it's false, but neither do we want to just throw up our hands and say, well, it's complex. What could we do? There is a place beyond the complexity where we can do something, and that's what I'd like to do. So what I want us to do in this session is to surface attitudes toward online learners, and that starts with our own, as well as those of our stakeholders. Consider some recent research and some simple ways to do our own research. Apply a couple social and professional practice theories to enlarge, enhance, and adjust our own thinking as well as that of our stakeholders, and consider strategies to influence our stakeholders to support online learners more and more appropriately, and commit to a new practice to help meet the needs of online learners. So just one thing. It's just like just one thing. We don't have to do it all, but we could maybe do one thing. So I want to start right out with a thought experiment for you. What do you think of these statements? There are 6 of them. If you just want to see if one of them grabs you, if you'd like to make a comment in the chat, that would be great. But what do you think of these? 6 different statements. These are all things that I hear. I have heard all of these things, some of them more than others, but I know that there are people out here saying these things. I'll just give you a moment to do that.
Doesn't look like there's anything in the chat yet.
And no one has to, but you're all invited to. We're going to address all of these throughout this presentation. There's something related to each of these, but let's just do a little bit of debriefing. And I just want to say from the outset, the outcomes are, your mileage may vary, their mileage may vary, everyone's mileage may vary. So that gets to part of the complexity. It's like those things might be true some of the time. They may very well not be true. Some of them, there's research that indicates that they are true. So far, for example, number 5, online learners do tend to be so far older, more likely to be female, and generally have more family and career responsibilities. That might be more or less true of different groups, different programs, different, and certainly is going to differ by individual. We can't make gross assumptions. And certainly number 6 is true, that everyone is unique as well as has things in common with other online learners and things in common with all other learners, whether they are traditional learners or adults. To some degree, learners are learners, and good practices with those learners have a lot in common. So their outcomes, for the most part, if you look at the research, which I have and continue to do, the outcomes are generally similar. There is not a good reason to say that online students are poor performers overall. If you look, for example, in my school, and I'm going to tell you in a minute about my students, but in my school, we have the same programs in person on campuses and online, including programs that I supervise and teach in, and our outcomes are actually usually better online. So it's not true that overall, as a rule, that online student outcomes, learning outcomes, are not as good when you even out those other factors, like it's the same school, it's the same kind of faculty, etc. Also, demographics, when we talk about, well, they're older, they're women, they have more responsibilities. It's funny because some researchers say that demographics is actually a proxy for lifestyle factors, whereas others say the differing demographics are actually what explain any disparities. So it, could, both of those things could be true. They appear to be a little bit contradictory, but it doesn't necessarily really matter when we're talking about how to address those needs. Let me just tell you about my students. I'm particularly focusing on one group of about 300 organizational leadership doctoral students. So they are extremely diverse. They're about 40% white, 40% African American, Black, 10% Latino, and 10% other. They are literally half of them are male, half of them are female. It's been this way for years. I know that that's really unusual. They're urban, they're suburban, they're rural. Their age ranges from the 20s to the 70s. Their average age is about 48. And so from my perspective, and part of why I get riled up when I hear about generalizations about online students, is my own experience is quite contrary to being able to make any generalizations about a group of people that are this different. On the other hand, they're all students in a particular program that they selected into. They selected the modality, they selected that discipline, and they're all there together. Those give them a lot of things in common already. But beyond that, I really can't make a lot of assumptions about them. They're demographically different, and even across and within those demographies, there's so many combinations of factors. So what do? I do have a strategy for how to address that. They generally socially group themselves within their cohorts by research interests and actually how much they like or dislike the program. You've got the people that are crazy about the program, think it's the best thing ever, and those maybe are a little insecure about whether they can really finish a doctoral program, and that's how they tend to sort out. And it's not really demographically. And if you see them we do have live in-person residencies, and if you see how they sort themselves out, it's not by what they look like, it's by these commonalities that they have established for the most part. So my perspective is that online students are diverse, complex, and dynamic. And when I say right now, I'm talking about, oh, the online, it's more women, et cetera, that might change. I can see that change, just the way that professions change, that a lot of times women start out being the ones in a profession, or men start out and then it morphs and it can go the opposite or remain diverse. So just because things are a certain way now, and COVID has changed things a lot too. And we've learned a lot through COVID, which when I talk about online, I'm generally not talking about emergency online learning, but about the planned online learning that some of us have been doing for a long time. So that's my students and where I'm coming from. So it might be extreme, it might not be, but I know that a lot of the stereotyping that I hear about online students in my own institution sometimes, that it doesn't really hold up. So we need another way of figuring out who these learners are and what they need. So then I want you to just think about your students and who they are. Oops, I get the sticky arrow keys sometimes. So think about that. I gave you a little snapshot of mine. Think about yours, and have they changed over time? Are they trending in a certain direction? How do you feel like they sort themselves out? And how do others tend to sort them out if they do? When we're working with large numbers, and I think we have about, in my division that I supervise, we have about 500 students. That's a big number. You do need a way. You can't just think in terms of, I'm going to have a personal one-on-one relationship with every single student in the program. I would love to do that, but I can't. I need to sleep and do some other things. So how do you think about them and figure out how to get their needs met if it's not on solely an individual basis? On the one hand, I'm saying, clumping them together can create some inaccuracies. On the other hand, we kind of need to figure out some way to do it. But it's okay. I've figured some of this out, and probably you have as well. So let us talk about your stakeholders. And if you think about those questions or those statements that I said, what do you think of these? Your stakeholders that are represented on this diagram might answer those differently than I know mine would, for the most part, would react to those statements quite differently from the way that I did. They might be in some cases more confident, more certain, having less information than what I do. Because again, that's not an indictment of my colleagues. That is how human brains work. So I understand that. And we have to figure out a way, if we want to get better at meeting the needs of our end user stakeholders, the students, we need to kind of train our brains to do something other than just making shortcuts without at the same time working too hard. That makes sense. So one question that I have is, how well do your stakeholders know each other? Because again, they might have they have different perspectives, and that's great, but they might then not be taking in one another's perspectives in ways that will help meet the needs of those adult online learners, those diverse needs. So think about, what assumptions do they make about each other? And then what role do you have? What role do we have in helping them to become more grounded and accurate? Just a thought. And no, it's not all up to us, but if we would like it to be different, then we have to do something to make it so. And I have some suggestions that are, again, they're simple. So here's some things that stakeholders think they know, despite what I said about, if you average it all out, the outcomes are really similar. You can't say that face-to-face is better. I've heard people say that. They can say that. Obviously, they do say that. But it's not accurate to say that face-to-face creates better learning outcomes categorically. It really is an inaccurate statement. That's fake news. What some studies have found is, among administration, the people that, make a lot of decisions about resources, despite these similar outcomes, perhaps in their own institutions, this is true, almost 2/3 of chief academic officers just think, it's just their opinion, the face-to-face is more effective. But the schools with the more online instruction they have, the higher the learning outcomes are online. And so that's interesting. So with more familiarity comes a better, more accurate context and better effectiveness as well. Similarly, employers, that stakeholder group, employers that have taken an online class, or maybe an entire online program, they have been found to be more amenable to candidates they're recruiting that have degrees that are gotten online. Faculty often experience a reinforcing cycle of low student and faculty expectations because, again, of that potential stigma. And believe me, I forget about the stigma because I'm in my bubble and I know what works well, and I see a lot of positive things happening online. And then I get caught up short when I get, and again, this could happen in my own institution as well as elsewhere out in the culture, where somebody says, yeah, online is, it's just this, it's just to save money. It's just for the students that, can't get into a real school. Terrible things. I feel like they're real slurs. And I forget all about them until every time I'm surprised to hear them again. I had a student admissions candidate ask me if I would ever get promoted into being able to teach on campus. And I said, well, no, that's not how it works. I don't want to teach on campus. I like online, and we'll talk about that in a minute too. But impossible workloads and cumbersome course design. I have experienced a bit of that, particularly the cumbersome course design. But so your stakeholders have different perspectives. There is also the potential for them to inform one another. There's a lot of ways of doing that, but any way that you can bring them together can be very helpful. I did mention polarity management, and I don't have the time to go into this a lot, but there are so many polarities to this topic. One obvious one is the modality. There's great things about face-to-face. It's much higher context. It does good things to our brain. We get our social needs met better. There's great things about online. You get to, we do a lot of asynchronous, and you get much deeper discussions than you could ever get in person in real time. People can go and read up on something that they have thoughts about. They can revise their thoughts. They have the time to revisit their thoughts. You get much more filtered and sophisticated and nuanced exchanges. So there's good things about both of them. There's drawbacks to both of them. If you lay those all out, you can figure out how to minimize the drawbacks and enhance the things that are already good. And then you'll start to see that things are really quite similar. You could do the same thing with looking at your learners as individuals versus looking at them in the aggregate or as groups. You could look at it, go back to that issue about, well, is it the demographics that seem to correlate with the outcomes, or is it the lifestyle? You could say, well, what's good about focusing on demographics? What's good about focusing on lifestyle? What are the drawbacks of focusing on demographics? What are the drawbacks of focusing on lifestyle? And try to enhance the good aspects of both of them and minimize the lesser aspects of each as well. And one obvious thing that comes to mind, it's like, well, everything should be more hybrid, right? To the degree that it can be. So that's the idea, is that it's not, as much as possible, if we can look at things as both and instead of either or, is more complex, but it's more accurate, and it doesn't have to be overwhelming or confusing. I also wanted just to bring up the idea of intersectionality. And this is often something that's talked about in terms of demographics. And we're all composed of multiple identities. And if one or more of those is socially marginalized, it can become figural to self or others or both. Or the other hand, so it might be like overly emphasized or leading with that. Or on the other side, it could be repressed. It's like, I don't want to be thought of as a whatever, fill in the blank. So I'm going to go out of my way to minimize that part of my identity. Or I might really own and lead with that part of my identity, like some of us childless cat ladies are doing. these days. And student can be such an identity. So it's not necessarily just an ethnic or gender or age or some strict demographic. A student can be an identity, and it can be a marginalized identity. An online student, even more so. And so those identities complexify and become complexified by those other identities that the individual carries. So it's makes it difficult to say that person is reacting to or responding to something because of X and isolating it to one particular thing. It is definitely more complex than that. Now, cultural humility. I love this. I used to work in healthcare, and it came out of healthcare. And the idea was healthcare is always concerned about cultural competence for reasons of health disparities. And you can see the analogy with the learning outcomes and learning disparities. So that was one thing. They were concerned about health disparities, but also just concerned about cultural sensitivity in serving patients. But in 1998, these two theorists said, well, really, it's more about cultural humility, because they actually, I remember these pamphlets I was in training at an academic medical center, and they had these pamphlets that would say, for example, here's what people from this culture are like. And on the one hand, it was like, well, that's good, because there's some things that you wouldn't know that you might want to know before interacting with someone from a different culture. But on the other hand, it was a little oversimplified, because one example, think about immigrants tend to be different from people that remain in their native culture. They might not fit that cultural norm as much, and they might not respond well to being treated vastly differently from someone else in the culture that they're now acculturated to. But beyond that, we just need to remember that we don't know what we don't know, and it's more of a skill to have that doubt and to ask and to be open-minded and not to be so sure that we understand what this group needs. So on the one hand, I'm telling you, we can know what online adult learners need, but on the other hand, it's an ongoing process of inquiry. Once we think we have it, we can be pretty sure that that's not really going to be the right answer that we can have forever. It's a process. And one of the things we need to do is ask and actually listen to what we hear. I hope that makes sense. If you have questions, please let me know. On the other hand, we do need those mental models, right? And so here's my own that I've made. Again, this applies to this is my perception of the learners that I deal with, and I put them in these 4 groups. I don't always know which group they fit in, but I have identified there might be other things. I'm sure there's many other things I'm not aware of, but for my own thinking, this is a way that I look at it. And they're different, they're distinct. One big group is, I would call them grudging, and I don't mean that in a negative way. I just mean these are students that wish they could be in a traditional program, but their circumstances don't permit it. So their needs are for a lot of social interaction, a lot of instructor presence, and clear reinforcement. And again, those are not bad things for anybody. So those are things that's like, oh, that kind of works for everyone, but maybe in a little bit different proportion. Another kind, and I'm thinking that that woman on the left is maybe that kind. Another is a large group for us is the thriver. And they're often introverted. They get drained by in-person social demands. Some of them have a social anxiety, but they appreciate the opportunity for space and reflection that distance learning and asynchronous learning provide, and they really take to it. Another group, and this is, again, this is that stereotype that's like, I don't know many students that are like this, but I have encountered them. They see online as potentially easier, and they might be prone to academic integrity violations or other kinds of shortcuts. Those, I mean, I think sometimes though someone might start out that way and they can be turned. They can be turned into a thriver, or somebody who maybe, yeah, maybe they'd rather be also in a traditional program, but some of them can turn around. And then I added the category, especially since COVID, of natives. And those are the students they might see online as the norm. And that sounds like, oh, they'll be easy, right? But not necessarily, because they might not be as proactive or articulate, able to articulate their needs and preferences. They might have less to compare to, particularly in higher ed, if this is all they've had. So they may be satisfied because they don't know that there are alternatives that might be even better. So that is a bit of a challenge, because the first category of students, they're often quite assertive and will let you know. It's like, I want more attention from the instructor. I want more opportunities to get together with my cohorts. But the natives might not know that they could be having a better experience than what they are. So it's just, in my experience, that's not IME. This is just my experience. You can make up your own model that fits your experience. There's nothing wrong with making up mental models as long as you are open to new information. Speaking of new information, this is based on a meta-analysis at Castro and Tumbay of just like, what do online learners need? And it when you think about it, it's like, well, it's kind of, wouldn't other learners need this too? And that's a good point. That's very true. But it is good to be aware of, again, how much learners have in common, just as being aware of how much adult learners have in common, and how much, how, in a way, the online learners are not all that different. So they have their own uniqueness, but a lot of good instruction and good support and good practices are good practices for everybody. This was an interesting study. This was actually during COVID. So all things are not equal. Um, they never are. They found that 4 things significantly predicted student satisfaction with learning: personal messages from their instructor, real world examples, reflective exercises on learning, live sessions where they could ask questions. But of all of these, you can see, those of you that are good with stats, personal messages far more, far stronger effect than any of these other things. And when we think about it, it's like, that is not a difficult thing to put into practice. We use Canvas. We can give video feedback on Canvas. Again, we do asynchronous. Like, well, how hard is that to actually do a little video note to students, or other things that is a personal message? So what can we actually do? One year institution has a place where they keep all the information about your students. Use that information. It's one of those things where it's continually gathered, but are we actually using it and intervening on it, feeding it back so all those stakeholders are aware of what the actual facts are? And those facts may be different than they were a couple years ago. And someone may have, had a very firm grasp of the facts, but they might be out of date now. So keeping on top of that and disseminating that information. Get lit. Check out the literature to enlarge your context and just see how things could be. We can start wherever. It's like, it's just interesting as a thought experiment to read about what somebody else is doing and extrapolate from that. Oh, is there a nugget here that we could put into place? When in doubt, ask, and always be in doubt. We often say, am I just like, did we ask the students? Did we ask them what it was? Did they, with this decision or that decision, did we ask them what would best meet their needs? Again, they might not have practice even thinking about that, but they're not going to get the practice unless we ask them. And be an advocate for this kind of inquiry with all your stakeholders. For example, my school has many programs and they all attract very different students, but we're definitely outliers, and they will, talk about, well, here's how you deal with young people. And it's like, well, but our average age is 40. It's fine. We have young people and we want to know how to deal with young people, but please don't forget that the average age of our students is 48, and that's different. And we just have to keep saying that as many times as is necessary, because again, people can be very certain without having all the necessary facts. So doubt is your friend. So those are my 4 simple things that you can do, and you're probably doing all of them already. But could you do them a little bit more intention? Possibly. I mean, I know I could. I was thinking about this as I was writing this down. It's like, wow, I need to do some of these a little bit more consistently. And that's what I've got. Do we have any questions?
No questions so far.
I will upload this and you also have access to the video. Terry, is there anything you feel like I need to elaborate on?
No, I mean, this presentation was fantastic, and I agree. I think that the perception that online learning isn't as good is it's a stereotype. And I love the point that you make where online and asynchronous learning really provides that opportunity for reflection and better discussions, because you can go back and do research and, like you said, reflect on what the discussion is saying and then add your input at that point, and have that space to do that and that flexibility to do that. So
And people need that, they do need feedback. They do need that socially, they do need that social presence, that instructor presence. They need to know that they are not just typing into the universe, that there's actually someone receiving it and giving them feedback so that they can continue to develop. But if you have that and you are continually, I mean, it is really all about that feedback.
yeah, those personal messages, like you said, and the importance of those personal messages with the success of the learning program, it's huge. And that's something that's easily done, right?
Yes.
And
Yep.
should be done. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So despite all the different factors that play into this, and how dynamic it is and changing, it's not that hard to just remember people need feedback. If we want to know what people need, we need to ask them, and then we need to actually do what we can to meet those needs. We need to connect the stakeholders, because if they could all be doing a great job, but not the same job. It's not coordinated, and it's not going to have the impact that it would have if they got together and sorted out their priorities around meeting those needs. If they could all see the same picture. It's great that they have diverse perspectives, but we need everybody to also be able to see the whole and put everybody's perspective out there for everyone else.
Yeah, for sure. Well, like you said, all students are diverse, complex, dynamic. So what I'm going through as an adult student is different than another adult student. And yeah, if we don't ask for their feedback and, inquire about what, their needs are, then we won't know. And their needs could be very different.
Yep. And changing,
And changing. Exactly. Yeah.
that's what keeps it challenging.
Let's see. Are there any other or anything in the chat? Any questions we'd like to ask of Julie at this time? Nothing is coming up. So I'm going to put a little thank you in the chat here. I did, of course, want to thank you, Julie, for this presentation. It's been fantastic. And then for all of those attendees joining us, if you can please fill out that evaluation at the end that's attached to this session, because again, we really like that feedback. It is greatly appreciated. So your insights really do help, shape the future of the content that we provide.
I have a lot of references, so I will upload that PDF, and
Perfect.
You can see where some of this came from.
That's fantastic. Thank you once again, Julie.
Thank you.